The auction started at 8 in the morning. By 9:30, the first piece of equipment had already sold, a hay rake that had been sitting behind the south barn for longer than anyone could remember. By 11, 3 tractors were gone. A grain cart had sold for more than expected, and a row of implements that had lined the fence row for 30 years was down to nothing but bare ground and tire tracks in the grass. Dale Merritt stood at the edge of the equipment yard with a coffee cup that had gone cold an hour ago and watched strangers walk away with things he had grown up around. He was 63 years old. His father, Gerald Merritt, had died 11 weeks earlier. Quietly, in the way that some old farmers go, more worn out than sick, and ready in a way that people who have lived that kind of life sometimes are. He was 81. He had farmed the same ground in central Illinois for nearly 50 years. And the farm itself, the land, the buildings, the equipment, was being settled now the way Gerald had written it out. The land was going to be leased, the house would be sold when the estate was ready, the equipment would be auctioned. That had been Gerald's instruction, and the family had followed it without much argument. Dale had 2 sisters, both of whom had married away from farming decades ago and had no use for equipment. He himself had his own operation 20 miles south and had more machinery than he needed. The auction made sense. It was what you did. He had walked the equipment list with the auction company 3 weeks earlier. He knew every machine on the property, some of them from childhood, some of them more recent. He had approved the list, signed the paperwork, and confirmed the date. It was only the night before the auction, going over the printed inventory one last time, that he noticed the Massey Ferguson wasn't on it. He had assumed at first that it was simply an error, the kind of administrative oversight that happens when a company is cataloging a whole farm's worth of equipment in a single afternoon. He had called the auction coordinator that same evening, and the man had been polite but clear. The Massey Ferguson was not missing from the list by mistake. It had been specifically excluded from the estate auction by written instruction. Gerald Merritt had left a separate document, not part of the main will, but attached to it and referenced within it, that directed the Massey Ferguson tractor to be transferred directly to his son Dale outside of the general estate auction. No dollar amount, no trade, no buyout of his sister's shares. Simply, the tractor goes to Dale. His sisters hadn't known. The attorney handling the estate had known, but had been waiting for the appropriate time to raise it. The auction company had been briefed. Everyone, it seemed, had known about the instruction except Dale himself. He stood in the machine shed the morning of the auction, while the activity of the sale went on 200 yards away, and looked at the tractor his father had left him. It was a Massey Ferguson 285, a machine that had come off the line in the late 1970s and had been on this farm for most of its life. Red, as they always were, though the red had gone to something closer to rust orange in the patches where the paint had thinned over decades. The cab was basic by any modern standard. The hours on it were significant. It was not a restored showpiece. It was a used farm tractor that looked like what it was, a machine that had worked. Dale had grown up around this tractor. He knew it the way you know furniture in a house you were raised in, not consciously, just as part of the background of things. He knew the sound it made when it started cold in the morning. He knew which direction the seat adjustment ran. He had driven it hundreds of times before he left home, and had driven it a handful of times since, when he came back to help his father in the years after his mother passed. But he could not explain why his father had separated it from everything else. And his father was no longer here to ask. The Merritt farm had never been a large operation. Gerald had run between 400 and 500 acres through most of his working years, mostly corn and beans, some oats in the earlier decades, a small cow-calf operation that he eventually phased out in the mid-1990s when the economics stopped working for him. He was not a man who expanded for the sake of it, or who chased the kind of growth that characterized a certain generation of farmers who came up alongside him. He was methodical. He paid down debt before he took on more. He replaced equipment when he had to, not before. That approach had served him adequately for most of his life. The farm was never prosperous in a way that attracted attention, but it was still there when some of his neighbors' operations had come apart. Gerald used to say, without particular pride or self-congratulation, that the goal was to still be farming at the end of every decade. He had made it through 5 of them. The Massey Ferguson 285 had arrived on the farm in 1979. Dale had been 18 that year, a senior in high school, already planning to stay in farming rather than go to the college his mother had hoped for. He remembered the tractor arriving because it was, at the time, a significant purchase for the operation. Not a desperate one, but one that Gerald had planned for and executed carefully, as he did most things. What Dale did not know, and would not learn for another 40 years, was what was happening around that purchase. In the weeks after the auction, when the farm was quiet and the equipment yard was empty, and Dale had time to think clearly, he began asking questions he had never thought to ask while his father was alive. He started with the family's oldest neighbor, a man named Howard Peck, who was 84 years old and had farmed the quarter section directly south of the Merritt place since before Dale was born. Howard was the kind of man who remembered everything about the people around him and said very little about it unless asked directly. Dale drove out to see him on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when the fields were harvested and there was nothing pressing anywhere. He sat at Howard's kitchen table and drank coffee he didn't want, and asked about 1978 and 1979, and whether Howard remembered what things had been like for Gerald in those years. Howard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Those were hard years for your dad." Dale waited. Howard said he wasn't sure how much he should say. Dale told him Gerald was gone, and whatever there was to know couldn't hurt anything now, and he was just trying to understand something he'd found out after the auction. Howard was quiet again. Then he started talking. The late 1970s had not been kind to a particular kind of farmer. The farm economy of that decade ran in 2 directions simultaneously. Land prices rose dramatically through much of the 1970s, and a generation of farmers had borrowed against that rising value to expand, to buy equipment, to operate at a scale the previous generation would not have recognized. The logic was defensible at the time. The numbers seemed to support it. Lenders encouraged it. The farm press discussed it. Federal policy, in various forms, suggested that the trajectory would hold. For Gerald Merritt, the problem was not that he had expanded recklessly. His problem was more specific and more personal. He had co-signed a loan. Howard explained it carefully, not hurrying, the way old men tell things that they've carried quietly for a long time. Gerald's younger brother, Dale's uncle Robert, who had died in 1991 and whom Dale had never known well, had been trying to start his own farming operation in the mid-1970s. He had needed a co-signer to get the financing. Gerald, who had a cleaner credit history and a functioning farm, had agreed. Robert's operation did not work out. The reasons were complicated. Some of it was the land he chose, some of it was bad timing, some of it, Howard said carefully, was Robert himself. By 1978, the note had come due in a way that Robert could not meet, and because Gerald had co-signed, the liability fell to him. It was not enough to take the Merritt farm, but it was enough to seriously damage Gerald's financial position at a moment when his own operation needed capital. He had debt he had not expected. His own lender had concerns. There was a period of several months, Howard said, when it was genuinely unclear how Gerald was going to get through the following year's operating expenses. Dale listened to this and tried to hold it against what he remembered of those years. He had been a teenager. He remembered his parents being quiet sometimes in ways that felt different from their usual quiet. He remembered his mother working extra hours at the school district office for a year or 2. He had not, at the time, understood any of it as financial pressure. It had simply been the texture of those years. Howard continued. He said that Gerald had eventually worked it out, not dramatically, but steadily, the way Gerald worked everything out. He had gone back to his lender with a structured proposal. He had cut operating costs in the ways he could cut them. He had made some decisions about what to plant and what to defer, and he had purchased the Massey Ferguson 285 in the spring of 1979. Dale asked how that made sense, buying a tractor in the middle of a financial crisis. Howard explained it slowly. Gerald's existing primary tractor had been failing, not dramatically, but consistently. A hydraulic system that was becoming unreliable, an engine that was costing more to keep running than it was worth keeping. In any normal year, Gerald would have replaced it earlier. He had delayed because of the money situation. By the spring of 1979, he could not delay any longer. He needed a working tractor to put in a crop. Without the crop, nothing else mattered. He had gone to the Massey Ferguson dealer in town, a man named Carroll Webb, who had been the dealer there for years, and he had told Carroll exactly what his situation was. Not asking for sympathy, Howard said. Gerald wasn't built that way. Just explaining the circumstances and asking what could be worked out. Carroll Webb had worked with Gerald Merritt for a long time. He knew what kind of farmer he was and what kind of man he was. He structured a purchase that got Gerald into the tractor he needed without a payment structure that would have sunk him further. It was not charity. It was a business arrangement that acknowledged the reality of Gerald's situation and treated him as someone worth working with. Gerald had put the crop in that spring with the Massey Ferguson 285. The crop had come in. He had met his obligations. By 1981, the situation with his brother's debt was behind him, and the farm was on stable ground again. He had never talked about any of it. Not to Dale. Not, as far as Howard knew, to anyone except the people who had been directly involved at the time. The Massey Ferguson dealership where Gerald had bought the tractor in 1979 was still in business, though Carroll Webb had retired in the mid-1990s and his son had run it since. Dale drove in on a Friday morning and asked the younger Webb if his father was reachable. Carroll Webb was 78 years old and lived 20 minutes from the dealership. His son made a phone call. An hour later, Dale was sitting across from an old man who still had the kind of handshake that suggested he'd spent 40 years demonstrating equipment. Dale explained who he was and why he was there. Carroll's expression shifted when he heard Gerald Merritt's name, not grief exactly, but the particular recognition that comes when someone remembers a person they respected. He confirmed what Howard had told Dale and added details that Howard hadn't known. He said that Gerald had come in on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1979, that he had sat down and laid out the situation plainly, the co-signed debt, the condition of his existing equipment, what he needed to get the crop in, what he could and couldn't commit to in terms of payment. Carroll said he had dealt with enough farmers in enough cycles to know the difference between someone who had made poor decisions and someone who had been caught by circumstances. Gerald was the second kind. They had structured a deal. Carroll did not go into the specific numbers. It had been a long time, and he said he didn't remember them precisely, but the terms had worked for both sides. Gerald had taken delivery of the 285 in early April. He had made every payment on time. He had never been late once. Carroll said he remembered the payment reliability specifically because it was unusual in the period. The early 1980s were harder on farmers than 1979 had been, and a significant number of his accounts had gone sideways. Gerald Merritt was one of the ones who had held on. He said something else, almost as an afterthought, that stayed with Dale. He said, "Your father came back into the dealership the fall after he'd paid off that tractor. This would have been the early 1980s, and he bought Carroll's service manager lunch and said he wanted it. Noted that the 285 had performed exactly as expected and that he was grateful for the way the deal had been handled. Carroll said he hadn't known quite what to do with that. Farmers didn't generally come back to report satisfaction. They came back when they needed something. Gerald had come back for no reason, except to say that something had worked out. Dale drove home with more information than he'd had when he started, and with a clearer picture of a year in his father's life that his father had never allowed to be visible. He spent several evenings thinking about what he now understood. The Massey Ferguson 285 had not been left to him because it was particularly valuable. It was 30 years beyond its purchase and worth in the used equipment market, a modest amount, less than a newer used machine, more than a piece of scrap. It was functional, but it was not exceptional. It was not a rare machine or a low-hour example or a particularly collectible variant of anything. His father had left it to him because of what it represented in Gerald's private accounting of his own life. That tractor was the machine he had purchased at the moment when things could have come apart and didn't. It was the piece of equipment that had allowed him to put in the crop that stabilized the farm's trajectory. It was the one material object most directly connected to the period of his life that had tested him most severely. A period he had never discussed, had absorbed privately, and had resolved through the kind of steady and undramatic decision-making that defined how he handled everything. Dale thought about the fact that his father had maintained that tractor for over 40 years, had kept it running, had not traded it, had not sold it even as the operation grew past needing it as a primary machine. It had become secondary equipment a decade or more ago, something used for lighter tasks and odd jobs. By any practical calculation, it should have been replaced or sold long before Gerald died, but it hadn't been. He thought about what that meant to a man like his father, a man who didn't talk about things, who didn't make gestures, who expressed almost nothing through sentiment or display. Keeping that tractor was the closest Gerald Merritt had come to marking something. It was his private record of a year that had mattered. And he had left it to Dale. Not because Dale needed it, not because Dale had any particular attachment to it from childhood, no more than to any other piece of equipment on the farm, but because Gerald had decided at some point that someone in the family should eventually know what that tractor was, and that the knowing should come to Dale. Dale was the one who had stayed in farming, who understood what it meant to carry an operation through a difficult year, who would recognize what the machine represented in a way that his sisters, through no fault of their own, simply would not. It was the most his father had ever said to him about anything that mattered. It had just been said in a way that required a certain amount of work to hear. Dale had his own farm to run. He had equipment that was more modern and more capable than the 285 in every practical sense. He had no operational need for a tractor of that age and specification. The sensible thing, by any calculation that didn't account for what he now understood, would have been to have it appraised and sold. He had the appraisal done anyway because he wanted to know the number. The appraiser gave him a figure that was honest and unremarkable. The tractor was worth what a tractor of that age and condition was worth. Not a great deal. Not nothing. He told the appraiser thank you and kept the tractor. He had it transported to his own farm. He put it in one of his machine sheds, not out of the way, not hidden in a back corner, but in a reasonable position, the kind of place where a working piece of equipment lives. He had a mechanic go through it and address the things that needed addressing. Not a restoration, just the practical maintenance that keeps a machine operable. New filters, fluids checked, a hydraulic seal that had been seeping for some time replaced properly. He didn't put it in a show barn. He didn't restore it to paint show condition. He didn't put a placard on it explaining its history or his father's story. He just kept it running and kept it present, because that was what the tractor had always been on Gerald Merritt's farm. Present, functional, unremarked upon, doing its part. His son, who was in his mid-30s and was beginning to take on more of the operation, asked him once why he kept the old Massey Ferguson when they had better equipment for everything it could do. Dale thought about how to answer that and decided the full answer was more than the question required. He said, "Your grandfather bought it when it mattered most." His son nodded slowly, in the way that younger people nod when they understand the surface of something and are willing to wait for the rest. Dale figured the rest would keep. It had kept for 40 years already. There was no particular hurry now. The auction had cleared the equipment yard of everything except the tire tracks in the grass. The neighbors who had come to bid had driven home with what they'd bought. The auctioneer had settled the books. The estate was moving through its process. The Merritt farm, the land itself, would be leased to a neighboring operation that had been looking for additional ground. It would continue to produce. Someone else would run equipment across it. The buildings would eventually sell. The farm, as Gerald Merritt had operated it, was finished, as farms always eventually are when the generation that built them is gone. But in a machine shed 20 miles south, A Massey Ferguson 285 that had been purchased in March of 1979 was getting its hydraulic fluid changed and its filters replaced and its battery tested. It had been around for every year of trouble and every year of stability that followed. It had been kept when it probably should have been sold, maintained when the maintenance cost more than the machine's market value justified, and finally transferred, deliberately, specifically, outside of the ordinary process of settling an estate, to the one person who the man who owned it thought might eventually understand what it was. Dale Merritt was not a sentimental man. He had grown up in a family where sentiment was expressed through action rather than language, and he had carried that approach through his own life and his own farming operation. He didn't romanticize machinery or attach more meaning to equipment than it deserved, but he understood what his father had said to him. It had taken some work to hear it. It had required conversations with an 84-year-old neighbor and a 78-year-old retired dealer, and several evenings alone with what they had told him. What his father had said was this: "I came through the hardest year of my life, and this is what I used to do it, and I kept it so you would know that I had been tested and that I had held." That was the whole message. That was what the tractor was. Dale thought that was enough.